I will start the recording. All right, so welcome to Math 119-312, the Mathematics of Pandemics and Risk-Benefit Analysis Response. I'm fortunate today to have some students joining us from the Windows on Williams program. I'm interested, how many of you who are in class today participated? So, a few people. So the goal is to open up our classes. Normally we would actually have these students physically here, but we do have a few who will be joining us remotely. I have put my email address here, so if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you in greater detail. This is a bit of a non-standard class for Williams. In addition to being offered at both the 100 and the 300 level, we also have some alums who are taking the class, not because they are credit shy of graduation, but because they're actually interested in the material. This is one of the nice things we can do in the pandemic response era, is we can actually involve more people now in what's going on and share their wisdoms and perspectives. Okay, so a lot of what we're going to be doing today is talking about how information is presented, what is the intent of what is being done. And so one of the stories I asked you to read, or one of the articles, was from Isaac Asimov on the Relativity of Wrong. Okay. So, as you've probably been able to figure out by now, I'm a huge fan of Isaac Asimov. I'm a huge fan of science fiction. Isaac Asimov, I think, has a really good way of writing about a lot of key issues. And so, the Relativity of Wrong, I will just read one of my favorite parts of it. So, this is about a person who is yelling at Asimov about how science has shown that we never have the right answer, and so we're never right. And they're basically equating all answers are equally wrong. And Asimov wrote to him, John, when people thought the earth was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the earth was spherical, they were wrong. But if you think that thinking the earth is spherical is just as wrong as thinking the earth is flat, then your view is wronger than both of them put together. The basic trouble, you see, is that people think that right and wrong are absolute, that everything isn't perfectly and completely right is totally and equally wrong. And when you consider all of the issues facing us as a society right now and the deluge of information coming at us, I think one of the key words we have to keep in mind as we go through all this is intent. What was the intent when the article was written? What was the knowledge available at the time? How many of you feel differently about the lockdown now than when it started half a year ago? So I'll put my hand up. For the first 2-3 weeks, I was extremely conservative in terms of what I would let my family do, in terms of we can just wait this out, that's what we're supposed to do. As it goes on longer and longer and longer, however, my views start to change. Part of this is gathering more data and looking at the data, trying to do a risk-benefit analysis. Do we have more data now than we did at the start? Yes. How many of you know who Ferguson is? From Imperial College. How many of you know why we entered a lockdown? Anybody in Zoom world know why we entered the lockdown?
To flatten the curve so that the healthcare system wasn't overwhelmed.
Okay, to flatten the curve so that the healthcare system wasn't overwhelmed. Why did we need to do this? Was there a danger of the healthcare system being overwhelmed? Or was there a perceived danger? Yes.
I guess both. There was a danger and there was a perceived danger. I'm muted.
Okay, so what has just been said in class is that if people were still going out their business, it would increase the likelihood the number of people who were infected, and that could overwhelm the healthcare system. Did we have a comment from the Zoom audience? Insectoid. but I have friends who do, and I will try to translate that later. Okay. Was this a real concern? Or at least was it a real concern at the time? Why? What data could you point to say, this is something we need to take seriously? When you saw what happened in other countries where the number of infections initially was small and then started to climb and then started to climb and then started to climb, what country in particular might have been troubling? Yes, Italy. So Italy was very troubling. If you start looking into some of the real data in Italy, a lot of interesting stories start to come up. In particular, one of the stories was that the flu the previous year was not as strong. It was not as violent, not as many people died, so you might actually have more people who are surviving. Is it a truly representative population? You also have very different healthcare systems, you have very different population demographics in Italy than in other places. Later, when we have people who are talking about how different countries have responded, which countries do you think did extremely well in responding to COVID and why? Yes. South Korea. There's a couple of other countries. Yes.
New Zealand.
New Zealand is one. There's other countries that share a lot of properties with New Zealand. And to some extent, South Korea has a similar property.
Taiwan.
Taiwan is another one. One of my colleagues is from Iceland. Any patterns? Ireland, countries where you can potentially isolate a little bit better, protect, who's coming in and who's not. And so later in the semester, we're going to have people looking at how much of a difference did it make when you went into a lockdown in terms of when the cases were coming in. Which responses can be moved from one place to another as we start getting ready potentially for wave 2? What information is going to matter? There is too much data out right now, it's almost overwhelming. We have to keep in mind the intent of the people when they're writing these stories. Are they trying to sway you one way or the other? Do they have an agenda? Are there specific facts that they're choosing to highlight or others that they're not? Are they trying to make you believe that someone is trustworthy or not? If you want to make somebody sound trustworthy in their speaking, how might you refer to them? Right, but how might you refer to them? You might introduce them as expert, doctor, or even higher than doctor. What's the highest term you could give someone that immediately instills respect and awe? Professor, right? In James Michener's novel Space, he talks about how during the NASA program, they had a lot of German scientists who did not have PhDs, but they were very talented and they were extremely instrumental to the US program. But it doesn't sound good to have Mr. testifying that, for enough money, you can convince the school to award an honorary degree, and now they become a doctor. It's extremely important to think about how are people presented to you that you are going to trust them. A huge amount, going back to the earlier question, of the reason we went into lockdown was due to mathematicians, or specific mathematicians and their models. Does anybody remember what the models were saying would happen to the US if we don't go into lockdown? 60, 70% of people become infected, and more than just become infected, about how many would die? Does anybody remember what the numbers were? These were the numbers that scared a lot of countries into going into lockdown. I read around 2 to 3 million. I wouldn't be surprised if some sites were saying 4 to 5 million. When you hear 4 to 5 million deaths, that's a significant amount. And again, you always need to put the numbers in context. And you need to look at, well, what is the track record? Is this a boy who cried wolf in terms of Ferguson's model? And that's going to be something we will look at in greater detail later. That this is not the first time his models have predicted tremendous number of deaths. Now, unlike some of the other ones, this one actually has hit significantly harder than other infections that have recently spread the world. But it is extremely important to remember what pushed us into where we are. At the time, do you think people were doing their best, or do you think there's a global conspiracy? The problem is when you have something that has a 2-week lag, if you don't act quickly, there is a huge danger of opening the door up to terrible, terrible consequences. But a lot of the models give different answers. And we've talked about the sensitivity of parameters many times. So just continuing. So there's a lot of different movie clips that you can show on World War I and World War II. I'm not sure how much history people know about World War I and World War II. Anybody want to describe roughly what World War I was like in Europe? Yes. A lot of trench warfare. And so I will show just one clip right now. So let's see if I can get ready. So this is from the funny British show Blackadder.
New tactical plan to ensure final victory in the field.
Ah, well, this brilliant...
Unfortunately, the sound is not playing, so give me 1 second.
plan involve us climbing out of our...
A brilliant new tactical plan to ensure final...
Ah, will this brilliant plan involve us climbing out of our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemy, sir?
How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information.
It's the same plan that we used last time, and the 17 times before that.
Exactly. And that is what is so brilliant about it.
The audio.
It will catch...
Basically, the clip would have shown a couple of people discussing strategy. And you have the generals in the beautiful Paris offices talking to one of the captains who commands the troop. And he tells them that your orders are at dawn, I want you to take your troops and attack the front of the German lines. And the captain is looking at the general in shock and horror and says, just like our previous failed 18 attempts. Exactly! They'd never expect you would do that again. And where will you be? I have some shopping to do in Paris. I wish you luck. Do you think this is a fair portrayal? It's funny. Do you think it's a fair portrayal of the generals? Why do they keep sending troop after troop after troop to attack the center? It's not working. It's better to let the other side attack. What are your thoughts?
They might think that eventually something will change, or they don't really care about how many deaths they get because they're not personally being affected.
So they're not personally being infected. The other clip is from a movie, Paths of Glory, where one of the generals is told, you know, if your troops can make some progress, we can give you another star and promote you. well, my troops know that I always protect them. But, I think we might be able to make this work. And so the question is, are you having individual glory for some of the generals going? The other thing, as you said, is it may not be working now, but it might be able to just wear them down. And maybe eventually you will finally get that crack and break through. And maybe no one else has another idea that could work. And it's very easy to get caught up doing the same thing again and again and again. And the problem is, if you're wearing it away, you may not realize how close you are. You may not realize how strained the other side's resources are. These are things you need to be thinking about as we are trying to decide how we want to respond to something like this. When people raise issues, how are they being portrayed in the news? Are they being portrayed as serious parties interested in a conversation? Are they trying to be ridiculed so that we dismiss what they say? Another thing which, as long as we're talking about wars, that I want to mention, one of the most pivotal days in the history of World War II was D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy and creating the Second Front. And General Douglas MacArthur was the Supreme Allied Commander in charge. And he actually prepared two statements. One if the battle goes well, and one if the battle goes poorly. And so his statement was, our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Very interesting in terms of, are we now at the point where no one can come forward and admit a mistake? Can you come forward and say, wow, we got this model completely wrong? It was the best we could do at the time. We put in the values we thought. Or do you now have a situation where people are forced almost to double down and they can't admit the possibility that they might have looked at something and gone in the wrong answer? That we made the best guess we could, the best extrapolation we could with the information at hand. If we have a situation like that, how often do you see people changing their views in the debate? What evidence is needed to get someone to change their views? So one of your homework assignments for the next few days, and it's at the end of the slides, is I want you to find at least 2 papers, and no more than 4, that are on opposite sides of something that's going to be mentioned later. And I want you to read them and see which arguments is compelling, what information would you need to really be convinced. Okay, so continuing, sensational journalism. So does this photo show that Amelia Earhart actually died as a Japanese prisoner? So is everyone familiar with who Amelia Earhart is? Somebody want to mention who she is? Was it a solo flight, or did she have a navigator with her? So she was flying around the world, a very famous pilot, and her disappearance has led to numerous conspiracy theories over the years. And this photo, in one of these stories, and there was a documentary on this, I think on the History Channel, and they've magnified it, you've got exactly what you want, this blurry picture, which could be whatever you want it to be. This is very similar to when we were looking at the Asimov story about the planet Vulcan. Is it there or not? Does that look like Amelia Earhart? Do people believe that she died a Japanese prisoner? Do people believe that this photo proves? It does not prove that she died a Japanese prisoner, because this photo was actually taken 2 years before she disappeared. And somebody found, when the story came out, somebody actually found this published somewhere and said, No, actually, this was published in 1930, I think 2 years before the incident allegedly happened. In a situation like that, it's extremely easy to disprove at least the claim that this photo proves that she died a Japanese prisoner. Of course, she could still have died a Japanese prisoner. This is just not the proof. Why do you think we have a story like this? All right, so I saw somebody, moving their hands in the standard international call sign of "it makes money." Right? It generates controversy. We are in a 24/7 news cycle. You need people to be paying attention, to be watching, to be spending money, time. Any, I'll say, magazines or newspapers that you trust significantly less than others, and you might see them in a supermarket checkout. As a hint, the Men in Black movie franchise says that this is the best investigative journalism in the galaxy. And they're probably the only ones to feel this way about this tabloid.
The National Enquirer.
National Enquirer. You'll get lots of stories about aliens, lots of wonderful photos, huge scandals involving celebrities. It's amazing how frequently these happen. Do you trust headlines like this? This is why it's so important that you fact check and that you are very careful when you put your name out there. Any Star Trek fans here? There's a Star Trek Voyager episode where it turns out Amelia Earhart was abducted by aliens and transported several hundred years into the future. For what it's worth. How many remember the Killian controversy from, I think it was the 2000 presidential election? I forgot to bring it in. I actually have the wheel from the typewriter. And I use this when I teach. I just forgot in my classroom. So there were allegations that George W. Bush used family connections to get out of serving in Vietnam. And several letters appeared claiming that the family connections were used and pressure was put on. This is just one of them. When you receive an exclusive scoop like this, what should you do as a journalist? Fact check. So what facts can you check? Again, I want to get you in the mindset so that when you're reading articles, I want you to be appropriately questioning. What facts would be very easy to check?
The date.
Is that guy a real colonel?
Yeah, is that guy a real colonel? Is this a colonel who was involved with Bush? Was Bush serving there in this time? Was the 111th Fighter Interceptor Squadron based in Houston, Texas? There's a lot of facts that are very easy to check. What facts might be harder to check? Who would you want to talk to? You'd like to talk to George W. Bush? That might be difficult, especially if he's trying to hide something. Who else might you want to talk to?
Typography experts.
Jerry Killian. Now, unfortunately, I don't remember if Killian was dead or not. You could try to talk to other people who were serving around that time, who might remember what was going on. So these documents appeared in a sensational manner in 60 Minutes too, and it ended up costing Dan Rather his job. He was one of the journalists involved. And it was fascinating to watch this live on the blogosphere as the television program is unfolding. You see the blogosphere erupt with, these are fake, and these are easy to prove that they're fake. So I'm just curious, I'm giving you a hint that this is a fake. It is claimed that this was written on a typewriter in 1972. Knowing that this is a fake, or strongly likely to be a fake, I will be careful, is there anything in that's a little suspicious to you? Out of curiosity, has anybody here ever used a typewriter? I'm sure we have some alums who are listening who've used a typewriter. Has anybody here actually used a typewriter? So maybe a little bit harder to notice. There's a couple of items. How many of you have used Microsoft Word? A lot more people have used Microsoft Word. What happens in Microsoft Word if you write 111th space? What does Microsoft Word do? It superscripts it, and it does more than just, well, and when it superscripts it, it makes things smaller. So let me just check the chat because we've got a few things coming. There's also autocorrects. And so if you look over here, it's 111th superscripted and very small. Can you do a small superscript like that on a standard typewriter? And this was one of the things that made people very suspicious about these documents. You can match fonts very easily. You can feed it through a fax machine to make it look old. But little things like that, they also talk about, in the next one, proportional spacing between words and a bunch of things, that there's a lot of concerns about whether or not this is true. Just because somebody tells you something does not mean it is true. Now, there's a really nice comment at the end. I'm presenting this information solely as a matter of technical interest, not a political statement. For the record, I'm a Democrat, and Woodward describes himself as an ethical anarchist. I take no position on who produced these documents and whether the allegations against George W. Bush are true. However, the following observations can safely be made. If these are fakes intended to look as if they were produced in 72, 73, they are remarkably inept. Minimal historical and technical knowledge would have led the faker to type the documents on one of the typical monospace typewriters of the era, which are easily available. Another one which I like is another possibility is that these documents were intended to be exposed as fakes. And so this could be a really deep strategy to try to blunt criticism by putting something out. And now once wolf has been cried, if evidence comes out later, well, we've all refuted that. And so I really want you to be skeptical as you go through all of these different documents. Anybody know about the British magazine, The Sun? When you think of reputable British publications, what do you think of? Yes. And so BBC, what else?
Times.
I'll do paper copies.
London Times.
The Economist, I think The Economist is British, I'm not positive. I'm thinking of like the Times of London, Financial Times. The Sun is aimed at a different audience. Speaking out, Chinese virologist who fled to US after coronavirus cover-up claims, vows to publish evidence proving virus is being made. And so this is going to be one of your homework assignments, though. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this first. There are very interesting stories about what is the spread, what is the cause of the disease. Going back to the disease was actually caused by the US military and implanted in China during some, I think, military conversations. Do you feel competent to read these articles and determine if the allegations are true or false? So why, I see you shaking your head, why? I'll put you on the spot, why not? Yeah, so a lot of people are shaking their head. And I will admit, I don't feel competent as well to read a lot of this. Why? Okay, so one question is, can we gather enough information? What else? Okay, say that again. We can gather enough information to decide if the allegations are well-founded. Right, so what might you need to determine if it's entirely correct or not? As a mathematician, I feel competent to do many things, but not everything. What might you need? So what do you think the case is going to come down to? So you have somebody who's claiming that the virus was man-made.
How credible is evidence actually is?
How credible is her evidence? So what do you think will be necessary to properly view and weight her evidence?
Knowledge about how you make the man-made virus?
Maybe knowledge about how you make man-made viruses, knowledge about how you would read the biological case, the biological argument that she's making, the analysis of the disease. There's going to be scientific claims that are being made. Do you feel competent to read all of these claims and to decide whether or not it's true? This is the same in the mathematical models. Do we feel competent enough to trust the models? So I was talking with some people, if I was going to have a textbook for this class, there's a couple things I would do. Moneyball by Michael Lewis would be one. Methods of Math Destruction, and I'm blanking on her name right now, would be another great one. And she talks very early on about the danger that happens when we have so many of these systems that have black boxes where we do not really know how the algorithm works, but we're supposed to just trust it. And the example she gives at the beginning is about a school district in Washington, D.C. that has not been doing well for a while. So they decide, we're going to fire the bad teachers, and that will make things better. And how do you determine who's a bad teacher? Well, you look at the score they get according to certain very complicated metrics. And what happened is one of the teachers who was really good was put in the very bottom. And eventually digging what seems to be the most likely thing that happened, the reason that her students were not showing much of a boost was interesting. So imagine you're in a system where, and this is just conjecture, you will lose your job if your students don't do well. For the record, Williams does not have such a system. You can all get A's, you can all get E's. What might you be tempted to do if you're a teacher and your job is on the line if your students don't do well? You might give them better grades, you might help them out on exams. And so if you inflate, say, the scores of fourth graders, and then they go into fifth grade and they have a teacher who doesn't do that, you will see almost no improvement, maybe even a slide. Can you trust then the output of these algorithms? And so for many of these things, we actually don't know how the decisions are being made. And it is something that you have to be so careful about when you are viewing all of this. How much do you think you need before you feel comfortable enough as a voter to say, I now have a sense of the argument, I have a sense of the facts, I feel I can make a decision as to whether or not we should have a second lockdown. So Israel has just gone into another lockdown right before the Jewish high holidays. The number of cases has been going up, and there has been a huge dispute in the Israeli government as to whether or not a lockdown is necessary, where some people are saying the economic cost, as well as the other cost of the lockdown, is not enough to justify doing it. Other people saying if we don't do it now, it's going to be terrible. It is much easier to make decisions after the fact, looking at the data years later. It is much harder when you're the battlefield commander and you have to decide right now, what do you do? It is much harder when you have to decide, we have a model that's saying between 2 and 5 billion deaths. What do we do? All right. So there's a lot of wonderful headlines you have on deflategate. This is, I think, one of my favorite in terms of just how they phrased it. The scandal is that the Patriots deliberately decreased the pressure in their footballs to give them an advantage in playoff games against the Indianapolis Colts and maybe other teams. Patriots under pressure in deflategate scandal. I guess, how many people are familiar with the deflategate scandal from a few years ago? What I really liked is that the commissioner of the NFL, made a ruling, and the Patriots had a right to appeal the ruling to the commissioner. They could ask the commissioner, "We'd like you to be considered." Okay, I've reconsidered. Nope, I'm good with my decision. When you watch this, there's a huge split in terms of how people view it. What do you think happens if you ask a typical Patriot fan? They didn't do it. This is bullshit. This is, the NFL, has had it in on the Patriots for a while. This is just absurd. What if you ask almost anyone else in the country? Oh, the cheaters are at it again. We've caught them cheating before. We caught them videotaping the Jets. This is just yet another example. Who do you think you should listen to in a case like this? So who?
I think neither.
Yeah, neither. So who should we listen to? So one is somebody who doesn't have skin in the game. And in fact, one of the best analysis that I read was somebody who was a New York Jets, he was a professor, and he was a New York Jets, he says, "Look, I hate the Patriots. I hate the fact that I have to come to the defense of the Patriots." What evidence do you think would be compelling as to whether or not the Patriots deflated the footballs? So we should know who to listen to, yes. I'm sorry? So one is, what was the data? And who do you think is going to help us interpret the data? So I have actually mentioned this law in a previous lecture, foreshadowing. From your physics or your chemistry classes. Ideal gas law. What happens to a football if you move it from a warm environment to a cold environment and the temperature changes? PV equals nRT. Pressure times volume is proportional to temperature. As the temperature decreases, what do you think happens to the pressure? It also decreases. Then the question is, how much does it decrease by? And eventually it comes out that the people who were measuring things, they had two different pressure gauges that they were using, and there was dispute over which ones they were using. There was also a different amount of time that the Patriots footballs spent indoors after the first half was over before they were retested. It was a much shorter time than the Indianapolis Colts footballs. So depending on how you want to do things, with a couple of very small changes, you can really highlight different aspects of the problem and try to push people in different ways. They sadly took this one down from the web. Anybody know what game this is? Yes.
The AFC Championship game against the Raiders.
Yes. So I was teaching at Princeton at the time, and I told my students, because they had their big papers due the next day, I will be in the department until such and such a time when I have to go to watch the Patriots play the Raiders. I will be checking my email throughout unless the game gets interesting. And the best way to describe this game is, this is the Tuck rule. It was the correct enforcement of a terrible, stupid rule. It's been taken down, but for a while you could actually, and I spent half an hour trying to find this audio clip. You had two Oakland announcers describing the game. And I won't play the clip, but Brady goes to pass, the ball is stripped, the Raiders fall on it, it's late in the game, the Raiders can now run out the clock, the game is over, and the announcers are celebrating, the Raiders are going to advance. And it's, what? Oh, they're reviewing, of course they have to review the play, it's just a mere formality that they have to review the play. And then the tone of the announcers completely changes as it's called an incompleted pass. And it's like, what the hell is this? It's the same event, but seen very differently. Now, football games for the most part are not going to affect Western civilization. How we respond to COVID, how we look at the data is much more important. And I really want you to be in this mindset. So I'm going to show one more thing. I'm not going to play the clip, and then I'm going to go and show some data from some students earlier today. One of my favorite characters in Star Trek Deep Space Nine is Garrick. For years, people thought he worked for a foreign government as a super spy. He would always deny it, and he was always telling lies, including even what his name was. And in one episode, his friend, Dr. Bashir, is just furious at all the lies, and he tells him the story of the boy who cried wolf. So can anybody tell me the moral of the boy who cried wolf? If you lie too many times, people won't believe you. And so he tells the story to his friend Garrick to try to convince him, you shouldn't lie. This is what's going to happen if you lie. And Garrick looks at him and goes, are you sure that's the moral of the story? And she goes, of course that's the moral of the story. What else could it possibly be? And as Garrick stands up and starts walking away, he says that you should never tell the same lie twice. Which I think is a far more interesting perspective to take. And as you're looking at the data, you can't keep maybe doing the same story, but can you shift things a little bit? So for the last minute, I want to shift to an image that was shared earlier today. This was shared by some people earlier today. COVID survival rate, 0 to 19, 99.997%, 20 to 49, 99.98%, 50 to 69, 99.5%, and 70 plus, 94.6%. When you look at this, what is the intent of something like this? What are the possible consequences of seeing something like this? So one thing is that COVID is not dangerous. When you look at these numbers, COVID is not dangerous. What might happen if people feel that COVID is not dangerous? They stop following rules, procedures, they stop wearing masks, they stop socially distancing, and what will then happen? Okay. Cases increase. So the question is, you always have to ask, what is the source? What is the story they're trying to do? What information are they presenting and what information are they not presenting? There are so many factors going on, to distill everything into just these 4 numbers can be extremely misleading. Is there any information that you would like to know that's missing here? The number of people accounted for? I can't hear you because there's some noise outside. So, okay, so hopefully this is, it says CDC, so this is data coming from the Center for Disease Control. But when you look at this, what would you like to know? Right, so one question is, what are you counting as a COVID death? And so there are people who have died from other causes but have had COVID and have been classified as a COVID death. But there's something I think more important that we need to know to get a sense of how to read this chart. So how dangerous do you think COVID is in America with this chart? Why not very?
I mean, according to the chart, the numbers you give us, it's like if I were considering getting this an operation and my chances of surviving the 99.997%, I would go ahead without a doubt.
Well, let's try to put things in perspective. Let's say 5% death rate. How many undergraduates are there roughly in Williams? 2,000. 2,000 is a nice number. What's 10% of 2,000? What's 5% of 200? Sorry, 5% of 2,000. 100. So if we have 4 grades, there'll be roughly 25 people in each of your classes dying. Is that a significant number? Is it likely that you would know multiple people who died? You're putting things in context. The elementary school, say, has around 400 people. 10% would be 40, 5% would be 20. That's a lot of people, a lot of kids who would die. Almost surely you would know a lot of that. If the death rate is that high, this is tremendous. If the death rate is 99.997%, I did this calculation before class, if you assume a country of 300 million kids aged 0 to 19, I think we were talking on the order of 6,000 deaths. And when you looked at the chart we had earlier in the year about how many people die from different causes, 6,000 is significantly lower than other things. You really need to know what is the breakdown of our population in different groups. And again, these are just giant catch categories. But what else does this tell you that you might want to do? So you're a policy leader. You have to make policy based on this.
Isolate people that are 75.
I'm sorry?
Isolate people.
Isolate the people who are 70 and higher, or maybe even 50 and higher. I'm still in the 20 to 49 category, but I'm a lot closer to the 50 to 69 than I am to the 0 to 19. And again, when you say 99.98%, well, in that whole range, how does that change as you get closer to the 49 to the 20? And again, there's going to be other things that are driving it. Do you have other things that will make you either more or less likely to be susceptible, or if susceptible, to have it significantly impact you? But when you see something like this, what questions should we be asking?
Maybe what's the age breakdown of the U.S.?
What's the age breakdown of the U.S.? And so when you look at that, we could go and we could show what the survival rate of people who are 80 plus and 90 plus and 100 plus. And I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, the town of Hancock, which is near us, had a 10% positive test rate. 10 people got tested and came back positive. When you have very small numbers, we have to be very careful about putting them in the right context. Is a number large or small? It's relative. And this goes back to the Isaac Asimov story, the relativity of wrong. We need to know how to put things in context. If I tell you 6,000 deaths, is this a large number? Give me an example where 6,000 deaths is large and where 6,000 deaths is small.
We have 6,001 people.
So you have 6,001 people. So the town of Williamstown is, say, 7,700. If 6,000 people die in Williamstown, this is tremendous. Give me an example where 6,000 won't even be noticed, sadly. The whole country, World War II, deaths in World War II. This is not to say that it is not terrible if 6,000 people die, but it's very different. You need to be able to put numbers in context as you're reading this. You need to find a way to try to understand how to view these. There was an article I read years ago about some energetic cosmic radiation. And I can give you the physical units they used to describe how powerful it was. It meant nothing to me, and I have a degree in physics. But the person who was writing it did a good job of putting it in context. And they said, imagine you have a lead shield running from the sun to Pluto. It would pass through that without any trouble. Okay, I've got some sense now of how energetic it is. When you are looking at all of these articles, I want you to be putting things in context. I want you to always be asking, what is the intent? Why are they choosing to show you the statistics they're showing? What statistics are they not showing? How are they building up the people who are presenting? How are they giving them credibility? What are the agendas of the people who are doing this? And I know we're spending a lot of time on this. We have to really get to the point where we are tremendously skeptical before we look at anything. All right, so for the last minute, I just want to quickly show your homework. Oh, sorry. I'm going to now toggle back to the other screen. So there's two homeworks.
Me, even when I'm telling the truth.
Have you ever heard the story about the boy?
Both 119 and 312.
No.
Because I want you to find at least
It's a children's story
on the origin of COVID.
about a young shepherd boy who gets lonely while tending his flock. So he cries out to the villagers that a wolf is attacking the sheep.
Don't do more than 4.
The people come running, but of course there's no wolf.
Which position convinces
He claims
you
that he's run away and the villagers praise him for his
really convinced you?
vigilance.
What was it that changed you? What information would you have liked to
Charming story.
Or if you're not convinced, why aren't you
Finished.
Professor.
Next day,
one PDF.
the boy does it again, and the next two.
Just how to do it.
And on the 4th day, a wolf really comes. The boy cries out at the top of his lungs, but the villagers ignore him.
Rabbit fox
The
problem
boy
with
and
this
his
matrix.
flock.
I am not telling you which road
Well, that's
is
a little
rabbits and
graphic
which
for
road is
children,
foxes.
wouldn't you
figure
say?
that one out. You should be able to.
Point is,
Assume you start off with
if you
100 rabbits
lie
and 2
all the
foxes.
time,
Do you think these are
nobody's
reasonable
going to
numbers to
believe you.
describe how things evolve?
Even
Professor
when you
Miller?
tell the truth.
Both. How many do you expect to have
Sure,
of
that's
each
the point, Doctor.
after 100 iterations,
What
after
else?
1,000? For those
That
of
you
who
should
are
never tell the
312,
same lie twice.
there's a couple of differential equations to solve in the beginning. The number 3 is to just prove that
Professor?
potential is always going to be good. And then the last one is, the fox-rabbit problem. But if you're taking this class as 312, I want you to write down a specific closed form of the solution. And this is to help us with our transition.
After telling me in no uncertain terms that he would expose this vile deception to the entire Alpha Quadrant, he got back in his shuttle and headed home.
We can solve it in closed form. In general, however, we are not
There
going to be
didn't
so
seem to
close.
be anything more to do.
And so you always have to be
So I
asking,
went back to
how
work.
reasonable is the model?
2 days
What is
later,
being
I
missed?
got the news.
When someone is making a model, if they have choice in making the model, what can they
I
do?
had one. Maria D'Italia, wounded in action.
Friend?
Friend of a friend. Actually only met her once.
They can manipulate it.
Friend of a friend.
And so sometimes you can manipulate it by
Sounds
choosing
a bit strange,
specific
but
values
we're
of
off to a
certain
pretty good
parameters,
start today.
others by
Captain,
choosing which factors to
We just
include or
received
not
word
to
from
include.
Starfleet Intelligence that a Romulan
so when
shuttlecraft
we're
carrying a
looking at all
high-ranking
this data,
senator has just been destroyed.
The question
Which
is,
senator?
do people have
Senator Vreenak.
good
He was
intent,
returning to
or
Romulus from
Professor
a
Miller?
mission to Sakara,
or
but his
does
shuttle
somebody have an
exploded.
agenda?
The
And if they have
Tal
an
Shiar are
agenda,
investigating,
are they
but
deliberately
preliminary
manipulating
reports
things
point to sabotage.
advance that agenda and why?
They believe that the Dominion is responsible.
When I was in high school, I had to do a
assassinated
report on
Romulan
acid
senator.
rain, and there was
Diplomatic
certain
mission.
reports
That
that were saying
changes
that the
everything.
acid rain hitting New England, where I was from,
could even bring the
was not
Romulans
due to
into
the
the
Midwest
war.
Power Utility Company.
Excuse me.
And they were sponsored by... Who do you think funded this research?
Professor, so everything you just said, hello?
My favorite was the study that reduced the consequences of acid rain in New England to Ontario, which was actually shut down 6 months
You
before
killed
the
him.
study began.
That's right.
That's what you planned to do all along, isn't it? You knew the data rod wouldn't hold up to
Always
scrutiny.
ask
You just wanted to get him on the station so that you could plant
Always
a
ask
bomb on
why
his
people
shuttle.
be
It wasn't quite that simple.
built up.
I did have hopes that the rod would somehow
Alright,
pass
so now we're getting
inspection,
to the
but I
point where
suspected
people
that
will be doing,
Tolar may not have been up to the
their
task.
readings.
And what about
So
Tolar?
everybody
Did you
who is
kill
in
him
addition will be
too?
working hard on
Think
that,
of them
trying to
both
group mates,
as tragic
group me in on
victims of
that.
war.
And the goal is to lead a conversation.
If you can
And by
allow
now,
your
I think
anger
we've
to
belabored this
subside
point
for a
enough,
moment,
but
you'll
just
see
how
that they did
careful
not
you
die
be
in
as
vain.
you're reading
The
the data, how
Romulans will
easy it
enter
is
the war.
to
There's
very
no
easily
guarantee
manipulate
of that.
Oh, but I
different
think
people
that there
with good
is.
intentions
You see, when the
look at the
Tal
same
Shiar
data,
finishes
as well as
examining the
other
wreckage of
people who are
Breenak's
trying to
shuttle,
grab
they'll
headlines,
find
trying
the
to
burnt
make money,
remnants of a
trying to
Cardassian
advance themselves.
optolithic data rod, which somehow miraculously survived
Have a
the
good rest of the
explosion.
day.
After painstaking
If anybody has any questions, I will stick